like most people have joined in now. So welcome everybody to the Master's Defense of Aaron Kratzer, Aaron Watt Kratzer. We've got about half an hour. Aaron's going to review his work here, leaving about 10 minutes at the end for questions. And everyone's, of course, very familiar with Aaron, so I think I'll turn it over to you and let you take it away. Oh, sorry, at the end of the half an hour, everybody will be asked to leave the meeting except the committee members, and we'll start the defense process. So with that, take it away, Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here. Welcome. I'm going to be talking about my master's research around this question of colony collapse disorder. So to begin, I'd like to briefly motivate this research question and then talk about the economic application here. So overall, beekeepers in the United States are used to winter losses. They normally face some amount of winter losses, but in particular, in 2006, beekeepers started reporting large, mysterious winter losses. Usually when they see winter losses, they see dead bees in or around the hive, and this can be caused by many different factors. But what was new is that they were seeing no worker bees, that the worker bees were disappearing from an otherwise healthy colony and eventually led to collapse. And this is unusual bee behavior. So this came to be known as colony collapse disorder, and this key identifier, the disappearance of adult worker bees, this is what we will be focusing on in this analysis, or what I will be. A national survey was started in 2007 to get a better handle on these losses and understand what beekeepers were doing. And biological research then surged to identify and explore these risk factors for honeybee loss. So let's take a quick look at those. Over the last 14 years, there's been growing experimental evidence in biology for specific risk factors for loss. So things like pathogens have been shown to increase losses, and things like more food have been shown to decrease losses. Some of these categories have different impacts inside of them, like there are some types of pesticides that are used inside of a colony that help, and there are some types of pesticides that are used on crops that have been shown to harm bees. This research, or at the same time of all this research, there's also been a lack of evidence for any causal mechanism for CCD, for this disappearance of worker bees. So the growing evidence plus this lack of evidence for CCD has coalesced into a hypothesis, and I'll be referring to this as the ensemble hypothesis. But it's this idea that CCD is just a combined effect of known risk factors, that we already know all of the things that are impacting CCD. So if this is correct, we can focus more on mitigations of known risk factors. But importantly, if it's not correct, there could still be unknown factors that impact CCD, which could increase losses. Also, there is still debate and not a good estimate of how much CCD is impacting losses. So we wanted to challenge this hypothesis and try to explore this question to see if everything is already known about CCD. So to test this hypothesis, we ask a few questions. First, is worker bee disappearance just a summation of known risk factors? We break this further into into testable questions. First, do occurrences of worker bee disappearance co-occur with overall loss? Does it behave like overall loss? Second, are occurrences of worker bee disappearance correlated with known risk factors? If something mitigates loss, if it decreases loss, does it also decrease worker bee disappearance? And is the sum of the risk factors we looked at before, is that sufficient to account for the loss that is observed in the US? So to explore this, we have some survey data. That survey that was started in 2007 kept going, but it's not experimentally controlled, which has made it challenging in the biological literature to really separate out impacts on winter losses and worker bee disappearance with this survey data. But as economists, we bring some tools to the situation. we can utilize the decision-making behavior of beekeepers to construct an economic model of loss. We can control for experimental nature of the data, and we can also estimate total contributions to loss by developing a structural model, which I'll get into later. So the potential contributions to biology here, well, to illustrate these, I first want to show you the structure of this situation. So we have environmental conditions that affect everything downstream. And then we have these humans, these beekeepers in the middle, that are also impacting CCD and honeybee loss by their choices of how to manage bees. So we can ask this question of management decisions. And by developing our economic and structural model, we can help separate out the risk factors and mitigations on CCD by seeing which have positive effects and which have negative effects. And that can give us hints at what mitigating treatments and risk factors are for worker bee disappearance. And that can be a contribution to the literature. Additionally, I mentioned earlier that there isn't, that the effect of CCD on the losses is still debated. And so we can estimate this relative mortality, that if a beekeeper experiences worker bee disappearance, how much more losses do they tend to experience? So I'll wrap back to this at the end. The rest of this presentation, I want to briefly go through the survey data that we are using. I want to spend some time on the economic framework, motivating the economic framework we use, and then briefly highlight some of the problem testing we've done and the results and what that tells us about these questions. So for the last few decades, the USDA has been collecting data on the total number of colonies in the United States. I want to use this to highlight a few important events. In 1987, varroa mites were identified in the United States, and experimentally, they have been shown to be an important risk factor for losses. And in 2006, colony collapse disorder was identified. But I want to point out that these total colonies each year does not capture the type of annual loss that we want to study. Beekeepers have the ability to split their colonies or really adjust for the losses they face throughout the year. So if you only ask how many total colonies there are, it doesn't capture annual loss. But we can use this data to test problems with the survey that we will be using. So onto the survey. We'll be using the Loss and Management Survey provided by the Bee Informed Partnership. And it has about 56,000 observations ranging over a lot of years, but we're going to focus on 14,000 of the observations because they have important questions that weren't asked until later years. Additionally, from this data, we can see that on average, beekeepers in the survey suffer about 41% winter losses. So this means that an average beekeeper in the survey would see about 41% of their colonies die over winter. So winter losses are just overall death. Whereas about 39% of the beekeepers reported worker bee disappearance. So if we look at how colony loss on the left and worker bee disappearance on the right is distributed, we can ask some interesting questions. So these are just geographic distributions. On the left, we see that winter losses are high in the Midwest, that there's a hotspot there. And on the right, we see that worker bee disappearance is reported in several hotspots in the Midwest, in California, and Florida. For example, this is worker bee prevalence. So that means, for example, in California, we might expect on average about 70 to 75% of beekeepers to be reporting worker bee disappearance. So if we review the first testable question I posed earlier, does worker bee disappearance behave like overall loss? Well, from these, we can at least see geographically that they're distributed differently. So that is not conclusive evidence, but it can point us in a certain direction that worker bee disappearance is behaving differently. So maps are nice, but the economics of the situation are important. So I want to motivate a certain economic framework that we use to address this issue. So Rosen talks about a linear price function and gives us certain assumptions that you would need. In our construction of this economic model, we rely on a linear price model. And Rosen tells us that to use a linear price model, the good that is being sold needs to be separable and tradable in its attributes, and there needs to be a partial equilibrium in the market for the good. So how does this relate to colonies? Well, in beekeeper markets, colonies are separable into their attributes, and you can trade their attributes. So for example, food, bees, and queens are components inside of a colony. You can actually take them out and trade them with each other. And beekeepers do this in practice. They will take a frame of bees and take it from one hive and put it into another colony. At the same time, beekeepers are participating in markets. They participate in input markets and try to optimize their choice of inputs given certain costs and the loss they face. They also have choices to operate in winter markets. They can just keep their bees at home. They can just sell all their colonies to avoid storing them for the winter, or they can sell pollination services, like going down to California to pollinate almonds. They also participate in these markets at the end of winter, where they can buy and sell colonies that have these certain attributes. So if we look back at this economic framework, these colonies actually fit these assumptions that Rosen gave remarkably well. And to begin our economic process, we start with just a really simple production function, that colonies are just a function. Colonies at the end of winter are the number of colonies that survive from the beginning of winter. And loss is just that proportion of colonies, that percentage of colonies that are lost over winter. From the biological literature, we know that loss is a function of treatments and feeding and pollination. So from there, we develop an economic model, and using this linear price, we're able to get to the end result that loss is a linear function of these attributes of the colony, of treatment and feeding and pollination and others. So what does this linear economic loss model how does that help the biological literature? Well, if we again look at this structure of the problem, we are focusing on the humans in the middle, these beekeepers that are making optimizing decisions. They are reacting to the conditions set before them, including prices of technology. And then beekeepers are responding to the beekeeper decisions. So bees are responding to the beekeepers and the environment and diseases. And we can use this economic framework and statistical tools to first control for the non-experimental nature of the data that can help us address issues with treatment biases and sample selection. And we can use our economic and structural model to estimate the total impacts that these management decisions that beekeepers are making, and estimate those impacts on CCD and on winter losses. So to test our economic model, to test all of these things, we have simple OLS models that we're going to be using. Worker bee disappearance is a binary indicator. So I just want to note that it is a linear probability model when you estimate that on using OLS that has known statistical properties. But otherwise, we're just using these two models where worker bee disappearance is a function of all of the factors that we've discussed, and loss is a function of worker bee disappearance and what came before it. So when we calibrate this model on our survey data, these are the base results that we get. And I just these are just selected variables out of the results that we have. And I want to point out, I want to interpret a couple of these real quick. So pollinating almonds is just an indicator that beekeepers pollinate almonds in California over winter. So we see here that beekeepers that are pollinating almonds experience higher rates of colony collapse disorder or worker bee disappearance. And in particular, beekeepers that pollinate almonds experience about 17 percentage points higher incidence of reporting worker bee disappearance. And beekeepers that pollinate almonds experience about 10 percentage points less loss over winter. So that means pollinating almonds here is a mitigating treatment on losses. And it also is increasing worker bee disappearance. So let's go back to that second testable question that I brought up at the beginning. Are occurrences of worker bee disappearance correlated with known risk factors for loss? Well, here we see that, for example, pollinating almonds is mitigating losses, but it's increasing worker bee disappearance. So that's another quick clue that worker bee disappearance seems to be operating differently than winter losses. I'll come back to this at the end. To validate or check some of these base results, we also wanted to address problems with survey data, sample selection bias, partial non-response, basically throwing out all of those observations at the beginning. If we include them, how does that affect our results? And non-experimental data. So we address all of these issues first by weighting by state colony totals. We also bring in all of those observations using missingness indicators and see how that impacts things. And then we also create control and treatment groups from our survey data using Mahalanobis matching and see how that compares. So I'm gonna go through and just highlight the things about these first three areas, and then I wanna focus more on the last one. So when we look at weighting, we've got our base model on the left column and our weighting results on the right. What we see is that some of the numbers change a little bit, but overall, in general, the things that important factors we're looking at seem to maintain their direction and significance. For example, we have pollinating almonds. It shifts from 17 percentage points to 13 percentage points in its effect on worker bee disappearance, but it's still positive and significant. And pollinating almonds for winter losses still maintains its direction and significance. So when we also check for this issue of missingness by bringing back in all of those observations, how does that affect our results? We see similar things where the numbers shift a little bit, but overall they maintain their direction and significance. And to highlight pollinating almonds again, we see that it's still impacting CCD or worker bee disappearance positively and significantly, and it's a mitigating treatment for losses. So this next one, we wanted to test the treatment estimates given by our base model by creating balanced treatment groups. So when we did that, here's just two examples of treatments on winter loss. So these are effects on winter losses. We see that first Varroa treatment in our OLS model on the left is a mitigating factor. And then on the right, we see it still mitigates loss. It's just shifted from about 8 percentage points to about 13 percentage points. So not much difference. It's still mitigating and significant. And worker bee disappearance is still increases losses and is significant. So not much to note there. So when we try to address the structure of the issue, we develop a structural model using the order of events that happens. I wish I had time to just give you time to read this, but I'm going to move through this kind of quickly. Basically, this is just an example calendar that a beekeeper would face. And we utilize this ordering of events to develop a structural model with many different sets of equations in it. And these are just the last two, where worker bee disappearance is related to all of the factors that come before it, and loss is related to all the factors that come before it and worker bee disappearance. So when we calibrate the reduced form of this model, it allows us to estimate the total effects, or the indirect and direct effects. So when we do that, we see on our left, we have our base OLS model, which estimates the direct effects of these factors on CCD and winter losses. And in the right column, we see our calibrated structural model, reduced form model, where we have direct and indirect effects. So I just want to point out a couple of things to help interpret this. For example, annual UV max, we see that it is not significant in indirect effects, but when we account for its downstream effects on later events, it becomes a mitigating factor in winter losses, in how it affects beekeeper behavior and later treatments. To illustrate this structure of indirect and direct, I just want to pull out two specific things. So I'm going to focus on pollinating almonds and CCD in their effects on CCD and winter losses. So we see that pollinating almonds is a mitigator for losses, that it decreases losses by about 10 percentage points. But at the same time, beekeepers who pollinate almonds also experience also report more worker bee disappearance. So it is increasing worker bee disappearance, and CCD has a positive effect on losses. So we see that there's these competing features of indirect and direct effects of pollinating almonds on losses. So when we if we are asking how much the total effect of pollinating almonds is on losses, we first look at the direct effects, and then we add up the indirect effects. And that gives us that estimate of total effects that we see over at the right. So we can incorporate all of these indirect effects, and we can do this same calculation for other variables, but if we look at earlier ones, then there's going to be a lot more of these arrows pointing around. So this is just a simple example. So if we look back at these results, this just gives us another understanding, an interpretation of how earlier events are really impacting everything downstream. And when we look at the third testable question I posed, is the sum of leading risk factors sufficient to account for all the annual loss observed? So we've done these checks on survey data issues. We've looked at these direct and indirect effects. What does that tell us about this question of the ensemble hypothesis? Well, we see that consistently our worker bee disappearance identifier for colony collapse disorder is consistently capturing and has explainability for winter losses. That after accounting for these known factors that the biological literature suggests, we still see that CCD is capturing and has explainability power for winter losses. So let's just wrap this up. When we look back at our testable questions, first, does worker bee disappearance occur with overall losses? Well, we saw that it behaves differently geographically, and so that's just one quick clue. But we also wanted to ask, is worker bee disappearance correlated with known risk factors of loss? Well, we saw some discrepancies. One example is that almond pollination is increasing worker bee disappearance and decreasing losses. So it's different between worker bee disappearance and loss. So the contribution to the literature here is that we can come up with a list of contributors to worker bee disappearance and possible mitigating treatments for worker bee disappearance, where almond pollination in extreme heat could increase the risk, or at least the beekeepers in our survey are experiencing higher worker bee disappearance if they pollinate almonds and if they are in places with extreme heat. And beekeepers who are in places with more UV light and that treat for varroa see less worker bee disappearance. So these could be mitigating treatments. And we also asked that question about the sum of risk factors accounting for loss. And again, we are seeing consistent results that worker bee disappearance is capturing something that is explaining losses. So the contribution here is that first we have an estimate of relative mortality, that beekeepers who are experiencing worker bee disappearance see higher losses of about 22 percentage points higher than beekeepers who do not experience worker bee disappearance. So that's, if you recall at the beginning, on average, beekeepers are reporting about 41% losses. So this is so the size of that is about half the national average loss rate. And if you do some quick algebra, that means that if you do some quick algebra, depending on how many beekeepers are reporting CCD, then that means about 18% of national losses are explained using CCD. So that's a significant portion. That's a big chunk of these national losses that were not previously explained by those risk factors in the biological literature. So when we go back to our big question, is worker bee disappearance just a summation of known risk factors? When we tested this question, we failed to find evidence that worker bee disappearance is just the sum of other factors. And that means we failed to find any evidence to support the ensemble hypothesis, the thing that we were challenging. And the implications are that there may still be unknown factors impacting CCD prevalence, which can impact losses. So that means that we should do further research to focus on identifying mechanisms for CCD, that it shouldn't necessarily be something we just brush aside because we think we know everything about it, but there still may be unknown mechanisms. So with that, I just want to make a few quick acknowledgements. The Bee Informed Partnership and USDA NAS was very helpful in data and in understanding some of the questions. I want to thank my advisor, Robin Cross, for the many hours we spent over coffee and in his office discussing things. My committee, Professors Lewis, Wu, and Toman, for their early feedback to my presentation back in December. And the AEC working group and grad students for all the feedback they've given me over this last year. You've been really helpful. And if you want to contact me further, you can reach me at that email. So thank you very much. And does anyone have any questions? I will open up the chat and the participant window so you can raise your hand or you can just talk. Yeah, you can feel free to just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Charlie, please go ahead.
Sure. So I know one of the takeaways you were saying there is there needs to be more research into these colony collapse disorder to try to like have a better idea of what's causing beekeeper losses. But sort of in the interim, was there anything? Because I know you have a very long list of causes and effects and things that could affect both of these. Was there anything that stood out to you as like something where a policy intervention could happen right now that would be significantly helpful?
Policy? Well,
or even just a management practice change.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's interesting is if we look back at here. So almond pollination is this interesting, I mean, there's a couple things here. I think two things that are interesting to note are that, well, first, almond pollination is a management practice where they choose to go to almonds and pollinate. This is an interesting economic decision because beekeepers in Oregon, in particular, have reported that the majority of their income in the last few years has come from pollinating almonds in California. So it's a complicated question because if you say like, oh, maybe pollinating almonds isn't a great idea. First of all, it's the majority of their income, so clearly there's an economic incentive for it. But also, overall, we see that beekeepers who pollinate almonds see lower losses. So even though it can increase worker bee disappearance, it may not be a mitigating treatment for overall losses. So I think there's some interesting things to explore there. Extreme heat, on the other hand, is an interesting one. That really has to do with beekeepers are locating both in the summer and the winter. So as a management practice, some of these results might point large commercial beekeepers to decide where to locate their operations. We saw that there were some large losses faced in, I think, North Dakota, and they had the largest beekeeping operation there. And after a couple of years of large losses, they decided to move their whole operation to a different state. So this could point in directions of practices where beekeepers are actually choosing where to locate at all. And one more is that Varroa treatment is already pretty popular. About 60 to 65% of beekeepers already treat for Varroa, but we see that overall it seems to have among the beekeepers in our survey, it has positive effects on worker bee disappearance and losses. So keep treating for Varroa mites might just be a good management decision.
Great. Well, I think if that's it, we're at time. There must be a kind audience, Aaron, and wants your committee to do all the difficult questions behind closed doors. So we'll move on to that phase. Thanks very much, Aaron, for a great presentation, and thanks to everyone who attended for your attention and support. And
yeah,
Aaron will need it.
Thank you all for being here. Don't forget, if you're in the department, we've got a happy hour, the last happy hour of the school year next Thursday. So I'll send out a reminder about that. So have a great week. Okay. So what I can do is I can just lock the room. Oh, I think we're down to just our committee. So that extra person is me, that period is just me. So I can lock the room now so that other people don't wander in. Let's see. Stop recording.